Okay, I'm assuming we're ready to start, everybody. We've got quite a number of people joined in already, and I'm sure more are going to join us shortly. My name's Ray Cashell. I'm a former chairman of Shelter Northern Ireland, and I've been asked to host and coordinate the panel discussion today, and I have 4 colleagues with me here. What I'm going to do is just ask each of them in turn to introduce themselves briefly and give you a short outline of what they're doing and what the key issues are for them at the moment. And then we'll get into some wider discussion. There will be somebody from Imagine Festival in the background controlling any issues. And I think if there's anything that you need to raise, you can use the chat button to try and sort of flag anything up, but we're not working on an open channel question idea, but if there is something, I think there is a device that you can sort of get a message to us. So we will start from that. Now I'm just sort of going in the order that people are appearing on my screen, and I was going to start with Kirsten Hewitt from the Simon community in Northern Ireland. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hiya, my name's Kirsten Hewitt. I'm the Director of Homelessness Services with Simon Community in Northern Ireland. I joined actually in January last year as the director, so just a number of weeks before we ended up in lockdown. Simon Community Northern Ireland just is a significant provider of homeless services in the country. We would have about 480 bed spaces on any given night, and quite geographically spread across North. So thank you very much for including me, and I look forward to the discussion tonight.
Okay, thank you. Next, Sean Mccary from Community Rescue.
Evening, Ray, and everybody else. I'm Sean Mccary, Community Rescue Service. I'm the Regional Commander and Head of Operations for Community Rescue Service. I'm one of the founders of it. Community Rescue Service have 300 volunteers. The whole organisation is entirely voluntary, and our job is to look for high-risk missing persons, including some people who are homeless. And we also respond to a number of crises in the community from different aspects. But mainly for tonight's discussion, we would come into contact with homeless people while we're doing our patrols in Belfast City Centre and other towns throughout Northern Ireland. And as I say, sometimes they are the people that we're actually looking for, because sometimes the fact that they're missing also means that they're homeless. So we too to come into contact with lots of the organisations that are represented here and others, and we're very keen to join in the conversation here. Very pleased to be involved. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sean. Danny McQuillan from Extern.
Thanks, Ray, and very glad to be here. I am the interim CEO of Extern at the minute, but my substantive post is Director of Services for Extern. Just to let you know, Extern work with approximately about 2,000 people every year who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless. And we do that through a range of projects. So we would have 4 hostels providing approximately 100 beds a night, supporting people who find themselves without a home on an approach which we would classify as being high tolerance, low threshold. We also have a multidisciplinary homeless support team consisting of fully trained social workers who work across the gamut of homelessness, supporting individuals and families. And again, that would be the sharp end of homelessness, the hard to reach, and those who would have underlying health and addiction issues as well. Some of the programs that we offer, alcohol tenancy support would be a program that we would offer, and we would support people to retain their tenancy. We have a street injecting support service for those hard to reach and street homeless individuals. And we also have a dual diagnosis assertive street outreach support for those individuals as well. We also have a floating support program for people who would have a criminal justice background, and that's across Northern Ireland to support those individuals from to sustain a tenancy, but also not to reoffend, which is really important. And then we also have our innovative Extern Homes project, which is a project where Extern have purchased properties to offer accommodation to people who would be homeless, with a very intensive wraparound support that's put into those individuals. And in the time that we've been running that program for about 3 years, we've had no return to homelessness for any individual who's we've engaged with. So say we do have a vast range of homelessness services, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion tonight with everybody. Thanks, Ray.
That's great. Thanks very much. And lastly, Martin Gavin from the Homeless Network in Scotland.
Good evening, Ray, and to everybody else as well who's joining us. My name's Martin Gavin. I'm Head of External Relations for Homeless Network Scotland. And so that's predominantly a marketing and communications role within the organisation, but I also sit on the senior management team. Homeless Network Scotland, just briefly, is what we call a knowledge into action organisation. We are, or should I say were, based in Glasgow before all this kicked off. We're now based at the four corners of the country, but we operate across Scotland, and really bringing people together. I think that's the essence of what we do well. We are not what you would call a frontline organisation. We don't provide services directly, but we're also a membership organisation, and very many of our 70+ members are frontline organisations. So we're very much in the mix in terms of what's going on out there. And over the last year, we've really, I think, been able to use our network to create a variety of opportunities for people to speak with one voice to government, which has proven very successful, actually. And some of the recommendations that came out of a group called Everyone Home that we helped to start off last year are now, I'm pleased to say, government policy in Scotland. So that's the kind of knowledge into action activity that we want to continue with. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Okay, thank you. You're welcome. So we have a number of questions that we could look at, but I was going to explore possibly initially the one that's sort of most prominent in everybody's mind is, what has the last year done to us all? You know, has the very strange circumstances you've mentioned, Martin, for example, that you're sort of now spread out all over the place and people are working from home, but a lot of the sort of stuff that we're doing by its nature needs to be still in the front line and still needs to be hands-on working with people. So I'm just wondering, I mean, an open question to any panelist who wants to pick it up first of all is, has COVID really made a big difference to how you do things at the minute? Or is there anything that you've been doing that you just can't do at all at the minute? Yeah. Sorry, Kirsten, yeah.
Yeah. I'll jump in first, and I'll just say a couple of things, and then the other panelists, I'm sure, will jump in, and we'll see where we go. Lots of the challenges that we have within the homelessness sector and working with people experiencing homelessness predate COVID. But what COVID did was it worsened or heightened a lot of the challenges that people face. As an organization, we're a frontline service. So we've had to deliver, and we've had to run accommodation sites and do outreach support services. All of that has continued. How we've done it has changed a little bit. And so we've missed for a number of months the high level of social interaction, whether it be through group activities, group work, face-to-face work with clients. We've done as much as we can possibly do, acknowledging regulations with social distancing and such. But you know, our staff have missed those things. But what we've done is we've continued to deliver services because they're needed, because the people that we work with need what we do. So it's changed how we do it, but it hasn't stopped us doing it.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments?
Yeah, I think from the perspective of our organization, we are, and in relation to your nicely framed question about how things have changed over the past year, our teams have been coming across on a nightly basis when they're out on patrol in Belfast, for example. In the past, a year ago, 10 to 15 homeless people or people who would describe themselves as homeless. Over the past year, they've seen that reduced down to virtually zero from the perspective of with the COVID situation. It seems to be that there's less people on the streets or available about the streets, and that organisations have found homes or shelter for these people. So the change for us has been we're still delivering our services, but we're part of that as we are out there. We do not come across as many people who are homeless. And I'd have to say throughout all the searches, we're doing about 450 a year for high-risk missing persons last year, the 12 months up to now. I think maybe one person and out of those 450 was described as homeless.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Interesting. Danny.
Yeah. Just I would agree with what Kirsten has said, that what we found was that this was a great shock to everybody. I think, nobody could prepare for COVID, and nobody had prepared for COVID. But what really struck me and heartened the sector was that the staff themselves realized that they were needed more than ever, and that it was a real call to arms, that we weren't going to close our doors, we weren't going to pull the shutters down. So we had to adapt, and we did adapt. We kept our doors open, but we put in PPE. We had reduced numbers coming into our office. We would have just off the street presentations. And what we found in the very early days was, a real sense of panic among some people. For instance, we distributed prepaid mobile phones, thinking that staff, if they can't get into the office, at least they can ring us. And after a number of weeks, we realized that actually, no, we could manage the presentations, but we prioritized what was needed. Our staff couldn't stay at home. They had to go in and support the residents in our hostels. That wasn't an option. And it wasn't an option because the staff themselves wanted to do that. They wanted to go in and support. They knew that anxiety would be very high among our clients, and they ensured that they wanted to do that. As a manager, my job was to ensure that they could do that, was to supply the PPE. But what we found initially was that there was a great sense of cooperation from across the voluntary sector, and certainly the statutory sector, because, as I say, nobody came with a playbook as to how we were going to manage this, and we managed and we learned together. So the thing that I take out of the initial stages of COVID and how we reacted was a great sense of coming together, a common purpose around supporting the very vulnerable and marginalised people that we always did support, and a sense that we can do this and we must do it. So on reflection, we really did see a uniting of, on common purpose across the voluntary and the community sector.
Yeah. Martin?
Yes, thanks very much, Ray. Just continuing Danny's theme there, I think for us as an organisation, as a network, if you like, it was very clear quite quickly that our role was going to be supporting organisations like my colleagues on the panel tonight who are out doing things on the street, doing things on the front line, and supporting on another level, really. And so we were able to rise to that challenge reasonably quickly and get a really clear sense of where we fitted into the picture. And as I mentioned briefly there, we pulled together a network originally of about 15 or 16 sort of director, chief executive level people into something called Everyone Home. And there's a little microsite, everyonehome.scot, which you can have a look at. It's now 34 organisations and academics, so homelessness organisations and academics across Scotland who are concerned about homelessness, but not government, not local government, so not housing associations. It's very much third sector. And really what we've been able to do over the past year now is to publish a series of route maps, which are on that site. And again, what Danny's just said, that coming together of the sector, in this case in a formal sense, although not unconstituted, but organised. We've been able to speak with one voice to government, really. And what that's enabled our colleagues on the front line to do, I think, is to focus on what they needed to do on the front line, where the meetings every 2 or 3 weeks that we've been having have been a chance for them to say, this is a problem, this is bothering us, we need this fixed. And between us all, we've been able to go to government. And so, as I say, some of the recommendations in those route maps are now Scottish Government policy. And we're delighted to see that, and very, very happy to have had a proper role in what's, what was essentially a frontline crisis initially. But it's been rewarding to be part of that response.
Yeah, that's great. Martin, you touched on it, and Sean as well. The Everyone Home, and we had the Everyone In, I think was the title for us in Northern Ireland. And Sean, your observation that essentially the on-street homeless disappeared from the scene fairly quickly. And my understanding is that everybody possible who was street homeless, at least in Belfast, was got into accommodation of some description very quickly. And it does sort of highlight that, once people like that were deemed officially to be really high risk, and it was important that they were got into accommodation, it was possible. So there are questions as to, if it was possible now, why was it never possible before? And, to what extent were there things like coercion or compulsion in getting people in? But it does appear to be the case, am I correct, that everybody, people who were street homeless were able to get into some form of accommodation and get some sort of support service? I suppose there are two separate questions there. So I don't know who wants to pick up on that one first.
Yeah, I think just follow on from what you were saying, from where I started that conversation. We're very pleased to see it. That's the case, because obviously we don't want to see people on the streets homeless.
Yeah.
And you're right. There seemed to have been a massive effort by lots of different organisations, including the people in the panel here.
Yeah.
And I think it's a credit to all those organisations that we find it, and I'm speaking right from the cold face, for want of a better word, that whenever we come across these people, I need to pay some sort of respect and credit to the organisation out there, because for us, we're not in a position to deal with the homeless other than if their lives are at risk, but we get off a great deal of support from the other organisations that are working together throughout Northern Ireland, and particularly in Belfast, to do this. And one of the other things that I've seen as a theme, and we've seen in the past as a theme, was there would have been people coming into Belfast and other towns, but particularly Belfast, from outside of Belfast and even outside of Northern Ireland, who then find themselves homeless. And I think another thing that's happened is that there was noting is that over the past year, there's been a lot less of that from the perspective of, and anybody we do come across is pretty much somebody from the local area, or from within a local range of Belfast. So not so many from further away, and certainly a distinct downturn in the people on the streets, and that's down to the united effort that was put in to make sure that happened. And the amazing thing about it is it's remained consistent. It hasn't just been for a month or 2 months, but it has remained consistent throughout the whole year, pretty much. That has remained the case. How long may it last?
Yeah.
Ray, if I could maybe come in, I would agree. And as somebody who tends to be critical of the statutory sector, or needs no invitation to be critical, if I can put it like that, I think we have to pay tribute to them, because they really did move very quickly. Now, your question over compulsion or coercion, I'll not answer that, but what I would say is that everybody was offered accommodation at a time when accommodation was essential. So I want to pay tribute to the Department for Communities and the Housing Executive and others who facilitated that. Now, at Extern, we work with people who have a multiplicity of complex needs, and many of the people who would come seeking our support, housing is just one piece of the jigsaw that they need support with. And what I would say is that these short term, and it was very much a short term, although unfortunately with the length of COVID, it has extended. The short term option of putting somebody in an accommodation is very much only a short term stopgap, because what is critical is the wraparound support, the ability for those individuals to access treatment for whether it's a mental health or an addiction issue. And where we've started and we've picked up in terms of our frontline staff, picked up is that some of these accommodations have broke down because there isn't the wraparound support that's necessary to sustain that tenancy, or there's not been the access to treatment because of the nature of COVID and the impact it's had on the NHS. So, I do want to pay tribute that we have been able to do that. But just a word of caution looking to the future, some of the accommodation was either B&B accommodation or hotel accommodation, and in an environment where there is no tourist industry and no business for that sector, we can accommodate that. But potentially, and looking forward, we're moving into a situation where we're going to see the supply of that type of accommodation starting to reduce as business returns to some form of normality. And also at the same time, certainly what our staff are reflecting back, and I mentioned earlier, we're seeing an increase in family breakdown and presentations for homelessness or homelessness from individuals due to that family breakdown or other issues related to the COVID pandemic. So at one hand, you're going to see a reduction in supply, and on the other hand, you're going to see an increase in demand. And I would just give a word of caution that that is something that we are concerned about looking into the future, because yes, we were able to move very quickly and accommodate those individuals, and that was great, but it was only a short-term measure. Longer term or medium to longer term, we're going to need a more strategic approach, and a strategic approach that does not just focus on the housing aspect, but focuses on health and justice. So those would be concerns that we would have looking to the future.
Yeah, indeed. And I mean, that does raise a couple of other questions. I mean, obviously a lot of what was put in place was deemed to be initially very, very short term, but perhaps weeks or a couple of months maybe in the eyes of people who were doing these things, and it's already been over a year. But there's the other thing there that, you know, there's a lot of concern being expressed about domestic violence and about you know, relationship breakdown, that the lid is on at the minute. Because people aren't able to move, and people are, you know, their options are. So is there a sort of homelessness boom that could happen? Because it's been the case by and large that relationship breakdown of one sort or another, you know, either children falling out with their parents or couples splitting up, has been one of the dominant causes of homelessness, along with contributory factors like alcohol or substance abuse. But is there an issue there that's just waiting to hit us when the lockdown ends? Martin, I saw you do. Yeah.
Thanks, Ray. First of all, just on that, it's probably just worth mentioning that there's a new piece of legislation, a new bill just passed in the Scottish Parliament around protection for people experiencing domestic abuse. And part of that, I mean, it's quite wide-ranging additional protections being put in place, but part of that is the ability of a landlord to actually end the tenancy of a perpetrator and transfer that tenancy potentially to the person experiencing the abuse. And that's passed. That's just last week in Scotland. So that's a really positive development on that front. Domestic abuse is the most prevalent cause of homelessness for women in Scotland, and I'm sure that's the case in most places. So that's a really positive thing. I just wanted to pick up on something Danny said about the support, and one of our roles in Scotland is we're project managers for something called Housing First, which is a programme that's been running in Scotland. Well, it's actually been running as a pilot in Scotland for around a decade on a small scale in Glasgow, but a few years ago we ramped the whole thing up in something called the Housing First Pathfinder. And the Housing First Pathfinder has now been running for 2 years. We've got, during that time, we've created over 450 tenancies, of which around 90% have been sustained. So 90% tenancy sustainment within a Housing First programme is right up there in terms of success, certainly as far as Europeans are concerned, and that support element is critical. So that wraparound support that comes with Housing First enables people to more successfully sustain their tenancies. And in actual fact, as I say, in about 90% of cases we've found, actually ends homelessness for that person in a tangible way. So that's something that there's quite a lot of eyes on Scotland at the moment around Housing First, because it rolls out across the whole country from the 1st of April, at which point the majority of local authorities in Scotland will begin to scale up a Housing First programme in their area. So very significant development on that front. I know that the APPG in Westminster, all-party parliamentary group on ending homelessness, are paying close attention to what's happening in Scotland. There's a variety of elected mayors and people across the UK also looking at what we're doing, as well as the Europeans. So we're very, very proud of that. And Danny's point is well made. You know, without that support, without that wraparound support, it doesn't work as well. It's not proper Housing First.
Yeah. Kirsten, yeah.
As the conversation was going there, Housing First absolutely is a really positive support transition for people to get out of homelessness, and it works, and we should absolutely embrace it. But it reminds me that there is a plethora of support. So Housing First won't work for everybody, and other avenues of support. But during COVID, I think, and you touched on it, Ray, when you were chatting there, where are we at in respect of demand, and how is the increase in need? And relationship breakdown has always been a reason that people have experienced homelessness. But what's happened during COVID is there's been an increase in the amount of people presenting for those reasons. So with Northern Ireland especially, there's more people presenting because of relationship breakdown, family breakdown. Also the people presenting, there are more females. Young people is a higher proportion of those presenting. So whilst the reasons have always been there, the shift has been quite subtle in respect of who's presenting and the primary reason they're giving for presenting as homeless at this time. And so we need to be smart and strategic in the sector about offering a range of support. And Danny's touched on it. People experiencing homelessness is not just the housing issue. And the wraparound support is so critical for people to help them to transition out of homelessness.
Can I just, Kirsten, just agree with you there that you're absolutely right. Of course, it doesn't work for everyone. It's not designed for everyone, Housing First. It's that people who've had the really tough experiences of homelessness and really need that support. The wider kind of rapid rehousing approach in Scotland is the approach that would apply to somebody who just needed a home, for example. And also, I think there's an issue around, you know, if Housing First doesn't work for someone, are we really talking about a homelessness issue, or is it a much, much wider and deeper public health issue?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and sorry, just looking at one particular thing that happened recently that brings very much to focus to mind is that we had an incident where we had to look for a young lady who had 3 young children and had been a long-term resident in a hotel room because of the situation currently, where not only did she need accommodation, but needed accommodation, and there wasn't an awful lot happening to give her a longer-term strategy on it. And what came to my mind about it was very much the case that, you know, we have to be careful, based on the points made by Danny and made by Kirsten, and again even by Martin. You know, something that's really important here. The figures could be easily disguised at the present minute in time. We could have lots of people in these who are described as not being homeless because they're in accommodation of other kinds, who, you know, and based on the theme we were all talking about there recently, is there going to be a sudden surge? Well, you know, where are these people all going to go then? So all of a sudden, whenever the normality starts to return, if you want to call it that, and things start to come back to some sort of pre-COVID situation. So I mean, a personal issue had happened recently. You know, there's one young lady who really finished in a very bad position because, you know, day after day, week after week, isolated in a hotel room, and, you know, far away from where her family and friends would be in home, and you know, it just becomes too much. And so the mental health challenges that come around that, then you've also got the long-term effect of where they're going to go, etc. So I think very much we're picking up here on potential for the future issues that's going to happen, and ongoing issues that are happening that are not actually being seen at the moment. They're going on behind closed doors.
Yeah, I mean, this does sort of bring in the question of, say, you know, well, we've tended in the past to look at the links between homelessness and mental health, but the loneliness and the isolation and the seclusion involved in COVID is raising lots of mental health issues as well. And you mentioned, Sean, that sort of suicide prevention, although I presume from your perspective it's at the sharp end largely. is an issue that's been fairly dominant in the conversation in Northern Ireland for a variety of reasons for the last number of years. But presumably, again, the last year or so has brought that even more to the forefront.
Yeah, and certainly homelessness,
Yeah.
you know, can be a contributory factor in people feeling suicidal or attempting to take their own lives. Absolutely.
Yeah. We've one other sort of COVID-related question, and this was, let's say, that's from how you Tam on the question and answer button here about the decision to prioritise homeless people for vaccination outside of the age bands, which was just announced in Northern Ireland, at least in the last couple of days, and presumably is rolling out fairly quickly. And I know there's been a separate issue as to the status of the key workers that we've been talking about in the project, as to whether and when they might get priority for vaccination, because you have the problem of people being asked, you know, the residents of some of these projects told they can't go out, but they've got a rota of staff who are coming and going, you know, and by definition, you know, it's impossible to lock all the staff in as well. So I'm just wondering, you know, are there, you know, alongside the sort of the everybody in or the everyone home project, is there a case for, you know, along with PPE, vaccination and other measures to try and protect people both working in and living in this sector? And thanks for the question to Tam.
I think, Ray, maybe if I can just pick up on that. And first of all, can I welcome the decision to prioritise, and I'll use the term prioritise, but to focus on vaccinating what must be one of the most vulnerable and marginalised communities in our society. And remember, many of the people that we're talking about have underlying significant physical and mental health issues, particularly physical ill health, and therefore it's only right and proper that they should be vaccinated. And because somebody is not is in a hostel, that shouldn't preclude them from receiving that vaccination. I think there was an interesting point, certainly when we led multi-agency group with Simon and DePaul and First Housing and others in the sector, looking at how we adapt to COVID. One of the things that we pushed from the Public Health Agency was that our frontline staff are as deemed as essential and emergency staff as those working in a hospital or anywhere else. And therefore that those staff should also receive the same protection in terms of PPE, and that should be supplied by the NHS, and also should have the same access to testing. And at the very beginning, that was not always the case. So in terms of lobbying and campaigning, that was something that we did push very clearly for. And then just one other point, and I picked up around those individuals without recourse to public funding. I'm straying a wee bit off the vaccination, but I think this is an important point to make, that our staff, the last street count that was made around street homeless was in November 2020, and there were 10 people deemed to be street homeless in Belfast, 6 in Newry and 2 in Derry. One is one too many, but that was the number. But what our staff were clearly feeding back, there were 60 individuals without recourse to public funding. And those 60 individuals were not eligible for a hostel placement, were not eligible for additional support, but because of COVID, they have been. So as we look to moving out of and into I hate using the term new normal or post-COVID, because COVID's here, we're going to have to live with it. It's not going to be return to normal, but those 60 individuals will still require the support of our agencies collectively. And it is an issue that will have to be addressed by government. So I just want to raise that as a particular issue. I want to go back and say, as I'm quite quick to be critical, I need to applaud, and I would say that the statutory agencies and their response to vaccination, I think, is only right and proper that they are vaccinating people who are homeless, because those individuals have a multiplicity of complex needs often, and certainly they should be vaccinated, and they shouldn't be discriminated against because of their lack of potentially long-term accommodation. So I would welcome that.
Yeah. Indeed. Yeah, I mean, I was going to try and steer the conversation a little bit away from COVID and the last year into some of it, a bit of future gazing. But before I do, maybe the transition is, I remember last summer when people thought that we were through the thing, and Radio 4 did an interview with some homeless people from the centre of London, and who had availed of the sort of off the streets initiatives. And again, those initiatives worked because there were a lot of large agencies with accommodation that they couldn't otherwise let, and therefore it was, you know, it was a win-win proposal to use empty hotels and other spaces. But some of the homeless people had sort of said, well, you know, there's no point in being out in the street, there's nobody there, sort of, you know, there's no benefit, you know, but as soon as things livened up, they wanted to move back onto the street again, not in terms of sleeping on the street necessarily, but the social activity, the ability to raise a little bit of money towards their needs and things like that. So, and then of course, if things clamp down, they go back in again. A lot of the arrangements are sort of temporary by nature, and, you know, as things open up, the options won't be there. We presume, for example, that the slowdown in the construction industry means that house production, which is the other factor in this, will have slowed down and be way behind schedule. I'm not sure how far behind schedule it is, but it certainly has been sort of greatly impeded. So there's a number of factors there that sort of, as we start to come out of this, what are the key challenges that we're going to be facing, you know, and hopefully draw lessons, as you've described, from the cooperation that is possible under pressure, as to, you know, what are the sorts of solutions that we would like to see built in to the future, or things that have happened in the last year that we wouldn't want to continue to be the case. I mean, the non-eligibles, the sort of migrating workers and others who are trapped here because regulations don't let them go home, and normally the answer would be you should go back to your home country, and with Brexit there's been a bit more of that, but they physically can't do that. So it is good to see, at least for the moment, that they're recognised as being inside the boundaries of the system. But how do we protect that situation? Because they are a significant proportion, at least in Northern Ireland, of the people suffering the most. So, you know, is there a sort of picture of where we go next? Anybody?
Is that in terms of no recourse, Ray, or just in general?
Well, in general, I mean, no recourse is one of the ones, and you know, I think if I could maybe say, but just briefly on that before, is that because Danny mentioned the idea of sort of buying our own houses to provide people, because we've looked at in shelter, we've looked at the idea of, if you step outside the funded system, then these rules that say you can't help people don't apply. But we've all become totally funded by government for the sort of work we're doing, and therefore these rules do apply. So it does raise the question as to, you know, does it mean stepping out and putting the collection tins back on the counters in order to help the people that the official system won't help? Or is there a way of redefining boundaries so that everybody who's destitute is eligible at least to be got into shelter, if nothing, if not necessarily the full package? I know certainly that rules under the health service have allowed medical treatment for people who find themselves in absolutely distressed situations, but it has tended to be very minimalist, and so there, you know, that's one particular angle. But you know, the various devices that got people off the streets into accommodation now, how sustainable are they? Is that a model that we might want to sort of embed into the system in future? And also, how do we ensure that the services that are needed are there, you know, using the lessons we might have learned in the last year? So, Martin, do you want to? Yeah.
If I may, just quick, there's a couple of points there that I can pick up on, Ray, and one is, again, a lot of the work we've done in the last year has been through Everyone Home. Just to be clear, Everyone Home was a collective that we all put together ourselves, rather than Everyone In, which was a government in England, certainly was a government initiative. So Everyone Home was a collective which formed rather than a government policy. So we've done a lot of the work that we've done over the past 12 months through that collective, actually, just because, as I said, it's 34 organisations in Scotland, including academics who care about homelessness and know about it. So one of the things we've been able to do is to put in place a new way of providing emergency accommodation in the winter, through hotels, obviously. And so the old night shelters, the Glasgow City Mission, Bethany Christian Trust in Edinburgh, who ran the congregate night shelters, those are now Housing First welcome centres, actually, where people can get a room, they can get washing facilities. It's a much more dignified approach to the whole thing. We can't see that going back the way. So in a sense, that's ironically, it's a positive that's come out of COVID, where actually this is something that we wanted to see for arguably, a decade or more, has been forced through by COVID, and we're now determined not to let it slip back. And so, so that, I think that's a really sort of critical point to make, is that actually you can achieve things in crisis mode, and I'm sure others on the panel feel the same. The other one very quick thing was just around the, in terms of that. Again, that Housing First is just what we've seen as a continuation of allocations within the Housing First programme, and indeed an opening for Housing First to become a route out of those hotels and temporary accommodation for people if it's significantly scaled up. So, yeah.
Yeah. Any other?
Ray,
Danny,
in terms of lessons learned through COVID, and I think said earlier that I think COVID will prove to be the greatest social reformer in our time. And I remember a multi-agency meeting right at the beginning of COVID where we had health, justice, housing, at the voluntary sector, at the statutory sector, and we were discussing the concept of socially distance and isolation should somebody test positive. And I made the point that if you were an injecting drug user who, and you mentioned this earlier, who you got your funding by tapping on the street, and you got your drugs from an interaction or engagement in the street, you were not going to stay in your room for 14 days because the government had determined that you're showing symptoms, and therefore, to protect public health, that's where you should remain. And I raised the prospect of potentially somebody being moved quickly onto substitute prescribing. Yeah. And the Department of Health said, well, okay, that's something we could look at, and certainly we could see if that can happen. And at the end of the conversation, just as we were about to leave, the police said, well, hold on, are you talking about a member of staff picking up potentially a script at a pharmacy and bringing that into a hospital? Well, that's actually transporting Class A drugs, and that would be illegal. I need to go and think about that. Within a week later, or the next week, the following week at the next meeting, we had a green for going both of those issues. So it shows that when we were up against it, people were able to move. People were taking decisions based on the best interests, not only of society, but of the individual. And I think that way of thinking, we can't go back to that. We must always continue that. And certainly in things that do need to change, there's a whole list of things that I would say that need to change on the back of this. Firstly, we need to move away from addiction being treated as a criminal justice issue. It's a health issue. It must be treated as a health issue. We need to look at homelessness not just as a housing issue with the responsibility being housing. As I said earlier, it has to be health and justice. And in terms of justice, when people are leaving prison, there has to be that through the gate approach. People can't leave prison just on the promise of having a sofa to sleep in. They have to have a great accommodation. If they have an underlying addiction issue, that needs to be engaged. They need to be moved on a substitute script or have other forms of support so that they don't overdose when they come out, and that they have to have accommodation. Yeah, the multi-agency, approach is vital. And we mentioned earlier in terms of particularly around females, and this is something that Extern we've been campaigning for quite a number of years now. There needs to be dedicated step-down accommodation and hostel provision and residential support with wraparound support for that cohort of very vulnerable females in our community that unfortunately living by themselves in the community often is not healthy for them, and also being in a mixed hostel is also not healthy because they are incredibly vulnerable. So we need to look at that. And lastly, you know, if I'm on a pitch here of what needs to change, I want to move towards us having an open and mature conversation about addiction. And in particular, let's move towards the medically supervised injecting rooms that we see work so well in other parts of the world, you know, because we're stigmatizing people for having addiction, which is a health issue. It's not a criminal justice issue. And I had a recent meeting with the Minister of Justice, who was very open to the issues facing people with addiction, who often present as being street homeless or are street homeless. And we need to have a mature conversation about how we support and properly support those individuals, because I'm afraid pre-COVID we were failing them, and if we continue in the same vein as we've done before, we are going to fail them. So I suppose, Ray, if you're asking what needs to change, there's a short shopping list of what I've been asking to change.
Yeah, and there was a recently publicised case here as well in terms of a suicide, which sort of highlighted the dreaded phrase dual diagnosis, which I remember from my working days, which meant that it was a mental health and a substance issue, and until one or other was removed from the frame, nobody would do anything, which certainly now it's 10 years since I've retired. I would like to think it's a bit better now than it was then. But I mean, that sort of highlights the whole question of how complex the problem is, and you know, that it needs joined up thinking and it needs adventurous approaches. So that, you know, there's a number of issues there. There was a question came through on the chat there, and I suppose it relates to the way we've described the everyone home or the everyone in, as to whether or not, you know, as historically a lot of the accommodation is hostel or hotel style. And in that environment, particularly since a lot of it turns out to be quite long term, what happens with children? You know, I mean, have we information about the predominance of children in this process? And if so, sort of what particular measures either need to be in place or are in place to protect both the well-being and the mental health of the children involved? You know, because homelessness tends to be seen as a single person or an adult phenomenon, at least in the public eye. So, you know, the children in homeless households. So, Kirsten again.
Yeah, Ray, I can tell you that during this past year, the numbers of families presenting has decreased than it had been pre-COVID.
Yeah.
So whilst singles and female, particularly young people, has increased,
yeah,
families presenting has been decreased.
Yeah.
In community, we have a hostel for families in Belfast.
Yeah.
And the support we recognise every time I talk about them, we don't support just the adults in a family, the entire family unit. And I think that's really key when you're a provider of accommodation for families. And we particularly have recently brought in a play and learning coordinator to help those children in those families, especially whilst there's been homeschooling, all those kind of things, to provide extra support. So it's different how, and it's that person-centered approach, and we deal with and we work with people. And so we need to treat families in a similar way. So the support, and I know Simon Community will not be alone in offering tailored support for children, particularly who are in the situation of being homeless with their families.
Yeah.
And it's a very sad and startling situation for us in society that is the case, but it's just providing the wraparound support to the unit as a whole, and recognizing that they're still a family. Whilst they're homeless, it's still the parents who are parenting the children. So it's not intervening at a place where you take over the job of being a parent for people.
Yeah.
I also wanted to touch on, Danny had spoken about lessons learned there, and I just jotted down a few things while Danny was speaking, and I just wanted to add with what has already been said, but to just add a couple of other things. I think one of the things that we learned in Simon Community was it really struck us how the social networks of those people who are using and living with us in services and accessing the support, how small their social network is. So whilst there was this general thought beforehand when nobody really knew what was happening with COVID and the pandemic had hit us, that people would be everywhere and bringing back COVID and a virus and such, it actually, we had lots of clients who didn't have the social networks that had been assumed that they had pre-COVID. And so that was a lesson that we really struck. And so that isolation thing became worse. So during this whole period, society is isolated. Homelessness is isolating to begin with, let alone throwing a pandemic in the mix. So that was really a takeaway for us, I guess. Working together, partnerships, working in the provider sector and with the statutory services has been the best way to manage this last year. And just before this session started, we were talking, and Danny and I were highlighting, as providers, we signed up to a mutual aid principle. So we recognize in the sector that if Simon Community has a crisis and an outbreak, perhaps in a service, that we can contact other providers who will help, and they will help with the very practical things. So if I know I could phone a colleague in Extern or a colleague in DePaul and say, listen, we're really struggling today, we don't have staff, and there will be people who will help us if we need it, because ultimately we're all working together for the people who need the support that we're providing as a sector. And that's been a huge takeaway. And I really believe that that is the best way to move forward, to maintain those provider links and the relationships with statutory services. And to highlight again, this is not a housing issue, it's health and justice. We have to work together. And so it was in the chat there, reference to the amount of money it costs, you know, during the year. And I can't remember who made a comment previously in the chat about it, but we go, homelessness in the UK last year was reported as costing up to $1 billion with the cost of a single person sleeping rough. And I think we need to recognize that homelessness is not just a cost to the Department for Communities. It's a cost, and it is an effect, and the impact affects health and justice and such like. So if we need to support people in the best way, we have to do it together. And so I'm hoping that as we move forward, that's what we recognize, and that is a big priority for us. Yeah. Thanks.
Indeed, yeah. That sort of touches on a question, and it's a sort of territory that I think is important for some projects and less so for others. And that is the question of volunteering, and to what extent, you know, particularly now, having a pool of volunteers is a way of dealing with absences due to self-isolation and so on, but also, you know, the controls that you need to have with a volunteering system. How practical are they? You know, I'm always reluctant to talk about it because I'm always afraid somebody in government will hear and sort of say, oh, well, people will do this for nothing. We don't, you know. But a lot of projects do work very heavily with volunteer input. And I'm just wondering, you know, both now and as we go forward, you know, is a sort of volunteer pool one of the ways of dealing with what you're describing, Kirsten, of being able to sort of balance, you know, the number of people available to help with the needs as they fluctuate. And that would sort of lead on to what can people who are listening do to help. But, you know, sort of initially, just, I mean, the mechanics of having a volunteering system, to what extent do each of your groups work in that frame? And, you know, is it particularly hard or particularly beneficial at the moment? Kirsten again, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So Simon Community has a fantastic volunteering opportunities for people to get involved.
Yeah.
We've just launched recently a move on coach. And this touches on that idea of people moving from temporary accommodation in services, whether in Simon Community Services or other providers, into their accommodation. And so we actively have been recruiting, and we've had some really positive interest in people in the community, in society, who want to help with the relationship and help people with the practicalities for the first weeks they move into a home. And it's a project called Move On Coach. And we have done that in partnership actually with the housing executive. And it's a really positive step for us. So that's something that is very real at the minute. During COVID, there's been different volunteering opportunities, but it's looked different. So a lot of it has been delivery of PPE, delivery of food, delivery, picking up prescriptions, those kind of ideas. But particularly at the minute, we are really focusing on tenancy sustainment. So preventing people from becoming homeless, but also when they move into accommodation, keeping them there, providing all the support that they maintain their tenancy so that the spiral of coming back into homelessness. And that's the key place for us for volunteers to get involved.
Yeah, very good. Any other panelists?
Well, we would be entirely reliant on volunteers for everything we do. You know, working through this with the volunteers, we find that we've got a much more of an interest than we've had pre-pandemic, in the sense that people seem to have got their heads to the space throughout the time that they've been dealing with being at home and spending more time with their family and watching everything that's going on in the world. There seems to be a rise in the interest in volunteering, and we certainly feel that there's more interest in trying to do something more to help out now. Yeah. And along, you know, again, may that last in that theme. The panelists picked up on a few things there, and one of them, and not to move on too far before I go back on it, and I didn't want to interrupt Kirsty or Danny earlier on there with it, but you know, I mentioned earlier on that we don't see so many people on the streets anymore, and of course the panelists referred to the fact that that's where a lot of the people in the streets get their income from, etc., and their social side of things. And you know, some of the comments we would get occasions would be from people who are on the streets and homeless that, you know, we might be the first people they've spoken to in an entire 24 hours, and that's at 2 o'clock or 2:30 in the morning, you know, along the waterfront in Belfast, wherever it may be. And I think everybody thinks that, and it can get the impression, people who don't understand this, that homeless people are sitting out there chatting to each other and doing things together, either legal or illegal, etc., etc. And there's a great need for education and continued education to the public that, and you know, and I know we talked about lots of challenges going forward. Danny was in quite a few things, and every one of them I would agree with, and Kirsten is the same. You know, we really need to think too about educating, because I certainly got an education when I got involved in doing the work we do, and that education was very much about, you know, that what we perceive as someone who's homeless is completely different from what people would imagine it is, and Kirsten mentioned there about families being homeless and etc. And I would again agree with what you said, that there's a change in the demographic of who is now classed as homeless. Anybody we're dealing with, and there are not that many, is not the older male person who's got addiction problems on the street. That yes, they're still there and they still have to be dealt with, but you're seeing much more, as you say, of females and young people and families in that situation. So you know, education, and I know we're talking about it here, and that's a place where volunteers can come in. Just to go back on your question, Ray, you know, where volunteers going out there and educating people, whereas they may not have the time or the skills to be deeply involved in some of the projects that like some of our organizations here that are on the panel are involved in. They certainly can, once they learn about the different challenges, spread the word, educate, get out there and do it. So there's lots of opportunities for people to volunteer. And if there's people watching this, you know, there's an organization and the organizations that are represented here and all the others out there that work together. And my experience is they work together seamlessly and on most occasions to make sure that the person, whatever their challenge happens to be, gets the help that they need. It's just making sure that you identify that person, find that person, and make sure they get to the right place. And education is a very, very important part of that. And the last bit I would say is that, you know, just because people are not on the streets and as visible now, I think that's another reason we should be more cautious. Danny mentioned being very cautious. I put caution down here and underlined it, and I would agree with him here. We need to be cautious about a lot of things, but one of the ones we want to be really cautious about is that we don't just assume the problem has gone away, because it certainly hasn't gone away. And it's very much, probably much larger and much different and more challenging.
Martin,
sorry, Danny. I was just going to say very quickly on volunteering. I mean, as I said before, we're not a frontline organisation, but we run a couple of programs where we work with what we would call associates, although it's a very similar kind of thing. People actually with lived experience who can go out and can talk and communicate with not only externally but also within the sector as well. Because something that's emerged from the Housing First programme has been a real awareness that there's actually a lot of education needed within the sector as well, and within the wider public sector, in fact, about the need to work together and the need to work collaboratively, and even the definition of homelessness and the kind of experiences that people have when they're experiencing homelessness. There's not always a high awareness there. For example, something we've noticed with taking Housing First out into the world is that you'll get feedback from people who've maybe worked in the sector for a number of years, still talking about people being ready, and this sense that that it's on the individual to be ready to get a house, and that goes very much against the evidence that we're seeing from Finland and from the USA, which is telling us that actually what that means is much more easily achieved when the individual has a safe and settled home to live in. So yes, so we do work with volunteers certainly, but it's coming from a slightly different angle, and that's been very effective with us.
Yeah.
Ray, if I can make a comment, or a couple of comments. Just picking up on some of the things that are something, we were talking about families earlier. One thing that, in extern, we work quite a lot with, supporting families to stay together where appropriate. And we're all aware of the impact of adverse childhood experiences. And there's a body of evidence now saying that, those have long-term detrimental impacts for the future of children. And we should be looking at early intervention. It's certainly something that extern we believe passionately about. And I think there needs to be, and I'm sure there is research, but we need to be mindful of the impact of homelessness on families and children, and the impact of the trauma that those children may face and their life chances following that early childhood experience. That would be something that I want to say. And there's fantastic work I know that colleagues and organisations that are doing. Kirsten made the point of something that's really really important. There's been fantastic cooperation across the sector throughout COVID, and I think that's something that's not going to change. We talked about education, and one thing that really struck me in I listened to the BBC today talk about the vaccination of homeless people. And if I heard homeless people as a term being used once, I think I heard it about 100 times in a 5-minute segment. Let's be honest, we're talking about somebody's son, daughter, mother, father, brother, sister. And there's not a homogenous group that are homeless. These are individuals. I think when we start using homeless people as a term, we take that away from them. We take away their dignity. And Sean, you talked about the loneliness of being homeless, and I remember talking to somebody who for a long time was street homeless, and them telling me that the first thing that happens when you're street homeless is you become invisible. You're no longer a person. People will avert their gaze when they're walking past you. They will not engage. So in terms of education, there is a significant amount of work that we can do, and we should be doing as a society around, understanding homelessness, understanding the causes of homelessness, exploding the myths around homelessness, and also encouraging and supporting people to engage around homelessness. And then lastly, Ray, volunteering. I'm passionate about volunteering. I got into the voluntary sector because I started to volunteer, and I've created a career in the voluntary sector because of volunteering and because of the difference that I see that volunteers can make. And like Kirsten and others and Sean, we have, at Extern, we have a vast range of opportunities for volunteering. Yes, COVID has challenged that in terms of, inducting people and how we're all working online and got used to MS Teams and Zoom, but those opportunities still exist. And it's a great way of not only giving something back, but it's also a good way of developing a career as well, and an interest. If you have an interest in homelessness or any other area, I'm very passionate about volunteering, would encourage it.
There's a question through there on volunteering. It's a wider thing, but it does raise the idea that, I mean, some organizations just aren't geared for it at all. And volunteering is not just a turn up and we'll hand you a spade type of operation. It is, you know, there's a lot of induction and training and making sure that volunteers are clear what they're doing. And, you know, there was a time when there were organizations who did nothing but sort of train and coordinate volunteers. You know, so I'm just wondering, you know, I mean, can anybody comment on just the logistics of managing volunteers? You know, I mean, in the sense that, yes, we would welcome them, we would like to see them there, but we do need to make sure that both they're getting fulfillment out of it and also that they're clear what needs to be done and what your particular organization's doing. You know, because I know with a lot of, particularly the sort of street support depends very heavily on volunteers. And I think the Fair Share the Food Bank project has a very high volunteer input. But I'm just wondering, have you any comment on just how, you know, why might an organization be reluctant to take on hundreds of volunteers?
Ray, I think you summed it up there a little bit with, you know, taking on a volunteer and doing volunteering and offering volunteer placements to people is resource heavy. It's not something you just wake up one day and decide to do. So there is probably an element where organizations would struggle is potentially in their capacity to do that. So if, you know, in Simon community, we're really keen on the support that we offer volunteers, really keen at the commencement, you know, as simple as an information session where we explain different volunteer opportunities, an interview process, references, and matching volunteers to the right thing for them and the right thing for service. All, you know, the volunteering opportunity has to work for the individual and it has to work for the service and the need. So it is resource heavy, and that's not offering, I'm not offering excuses. It's just, it's a fact. It's not something that we can wake up tomorrow and do without putting effort into it. And we're fortunate enough to have the resource able to offer those opportunities to people. It's also a place where our volunteers require training, you know, safeguarding, the basic mandatory access disclosure checks, all those kind of things have to happen. So there is an element of volunteer being treated and being given opportunities similar, not the same, but as an employee. And I think it's key that there's the right contacts in the organization. So I know from our position that's how we treat and we manage the volunteering aspects.
Sorry, as an organization that has relies on 300 plus volunteers to exist, we everything from our accountants right through to our solicitors, right through to the people that go out and do the work on the ground are entirely voluntary, because that's just how our ethos is and how we work. So we're very well geared up for volunteers. However, just to go back to a few of the comments and the question went there, it's about expectation. A person who volunteers the time has a certain expectation, and the organization that needs that voluntary time has an expectation. It's about making sure that both of those are very clearly understood right from the word go. And just because somebody volunteers, and it's really important for people to understand this, their time, which is one of the most valuable things in the world, is the most valuable thing, because you know no amount of money would pay you for your time. It just helps you get compensated slightly. So whenever people look for someone to work for them, they don't work there because they're getting paid. They work there because they want to work there. And volunteers are there because they want to be there, just the same as a paid person. And for us, I mean, it's really, really straightforward. We often turn away volunteers, and that sounds an awful thing to say, because their expectations will not be met and they're going to be disappointed, or vice versa. So we're going to be disappointed because of what their expectations. But generally speaking, the voluntary side of it for us is the only way we can run our services. Certain organizations it suits very, very well. Other certain organizations it doesn't. And I think anybody who's I've seen some of the comments that were on the chat, anybody who's been disappointed or has been felt to be let down by offering their time and not managing to get taken up or have an uptake on it, just have a look around and look for something that fits better for what you're trying to do, and don't give up on it. And I would encourage everybody to do what they can to because that voluntary time is probably the best gift you could give anybody in the world. You know, if you give an hour, that hour could be life-changing. If you give a minute, it could be life-changing. And I'd have to say, it doesn't just change the person you help's life, it probably could change your life as well.
Yeah. Loosely related to that, because one of the reasons that people volunteer, is only one of many reasons they volunteer, is the social aspect of it, that they're working with a group and they're getting together. And that's the one thing that we're not doing now. Now, I presume also among staff that the sort of peer support and the sort of collective consciousness is a big part of keeping morale up and keeping keeping staff grounded and looking after their well-being and mental health. So has that proved particularly problematic for you organizationally in terms of, sort of staff feeling that they're in a silo or that they're isolated, and the opportunities that you normally would have had to try and share experience and talk through problems is impeded by our present situation? And if so, what sort of ways have you found to deal with that?
Yeah, I'm happy to start that one off again for you, just very briefly. The type of work that we do, which is very, very difficult at times, and when we're called, it's a last step, it's a last resource at the end of the day. So the person's life is at immediate risk for some reason or whatever another, and we do deal with some extremely traumatic situations throughout the year. So the social bit for our volunteers is really, really important, and the de-stressing, the debriefing, the spending the time, and because that's the thing that keeps everybody level and not pushes them into the same position as the person that just helped. So it is really important, even through the situations like the pandemic, that we find means by which we can continue to provide that organized support, that feeling of belonging, that feeling of achievement, the things that are really, really important, that make sure that not just for volunteers, but even for paid staff and for people who are employed, that they don't lose that social interaction that carries you through very, very difficult jobs. And most of the people, or often all the people that are in this panel, and their teams are involved in extremely difficult jobs. And I think that's again where education, because I don't think a lot of the population understand just how difficult dealing with the issues that are out there can be for the staff and for the volunteers and for everyone involved. So having that support network is vital, very, very vital, very important. And we have found means by which we really continue that throughout the pandemic, and seen the results of that and keeping the team together as we go through it. And just to finish off, if you just could say, one of the things I think the volunteering in the case of homelessness could be really good for, because from our experience, it's something that a lot of the people we come across or have come across in the past look out for, is an advocate, having someone who's going to advocate for them, because we find that lots of people in homeless situation are finding themselves where they don't. It was referred to earlier on, I think Danny or Kirsten, about they seem invisible. I think Danny mentioned invisible, but also have no voice, and sometimes don't even know how to deal with. Don't have the means by which the capacity or to deal with social service or want to be or anything else. So having an advocacy of some kind in place, and again, that's where volunteers who can be trained to become the advocates for people who are homeless. So, I just dropping that in at the end for someone that maybe wants to pick up on it before the end of the discussion.
Okay, anybody else on that?
Very happy to come in, Sean. It's quite interesting. Our external homes project was really aimed at catching people who were falling through the cracks, who were at risk of becoming homelessness, but didn't have the supports that traditionally other people may have had. And the first tenant we had, so we went out and we purchased a home. And the first tenant was somebody who, it was not an untypical route into homelessness. They had been in a relationship that broke down. They had moved in back to their parents' house. The mother passed away. The house was in the mother's name. The individual then started sleeping in their car and then moved into a hostel. We'd engaged with them just at the point at which I think they'd been in the hostel a couple of weeks. But we moved them through into in their home. It was a housing first approach. We did the wraparound support, and the individual would say, I didn't have an addiction, I didn't have a mental health issue, but if I'd stayed in the hostel much longer, I think I could have developed both. But we supported the individual. We supported them through the wraparound support. We also have employability support through extern, and that individual then became an advocate for people who were homeless, and supported extern in terms of lobbying and campaigning So that service user experience was really, really vital in terms of getting the message across, and could speak from a point of experience. And I'm delighted to say that they then went on to take up a post working for another homeless charity that I'll not mention, but is currently on the screen at the minute. And we were delighted by that, because they were able, you know, that was a true partnership working, but they were able then to deliver their service from a point of knowledge, you know, and that's so critical. So in terms of advocacy, you know, having that lived experience is vital for that, and somebody can talk from a point of experience. But I think there is more that we can do, and unfortunately, in terms of the impact on our staff, I think that was one of the, somebody had raised that. Yeah. I said earlier, at the beginning of COVID, there really was a sense of almost going to war. You know, staff were determined to do this. And we put up systems around staff, then bubbled in certain teams, so that if there was an outbreak, it could be contained within those teams. They went over and above. We all got used to speaking to each other on a screen. And I think in the first wave, people got through that. We got in the summer. I think people were grand fat. By the time the second wave, we've noticed more fatigue within our staff teams. People really are struggling with that lack of social contact that they would have normally had through the normal workplace. And we've had to put in systems of, you know, changing the working day, being flexible with people, because, you know, our staff were homeschooling for many staff. That was a new thing that they had to do. So working 9 to 5 wasn't necessarily conducive to homeschooling at the same time. So we were changing the way we work, and the working pattern for some changed. And we also then brought in limited time on screen, so that we wouldn't be doing MS Teams calls for more than an hour. We wouldn't have them first thing in the morning, and we certainly didn't have them, say, between 4 and 5, which allowed people then to complete their work, finish if they were finishing at 5, and then compartmentalize that area of their work, and then they could have a family life. And there was a separation, especially for those that were working from home. The other area that, you know, just to flag up, that is something that we take incredibly seriously, and I know it's not just extern, I know partners in other organizations face that, is that the demographic of people who are coming into our hostels have changed. It is not older people, primarily older men, who through relationship breakdown now find themselves living in a hostel. We're talking about more, unfortunately, younger people with chaotic behaviors, underlying mental health and addiction issues. So it's not unusual for our staff now to potentially resuscitate people who have overdosed, and that's unfortunately become more and more common practice. Now, when that happens in pre-COVID, we were able to decompress those staff by engaging with, you know, management and their peers. That becomes more problematic when you're working in a smaller team, and that is something that we need to consider, because the mental health of our staff is vital if we're going to continue to deliver service. So I touched on a few things, but it's just some thoughts on how, you know, as we're moving on, things that we really do need to be mindful of.
Yeah.
Kirsten, Ray, can I just second pretty much everything Danny said there about staff? I have to say, being a director in Simon Community, genuinely at the end of this year, I couldn't be prouder of the staff that we have in the service and the staff that I've supported in the sector. And Danny's entirely right. You know, gosh, I read the incident reports that come in, and the clients and the situations, and the use of naloxone, which happens just on a very regular basis in services. And our staff are doing that on a daily basis. And I think as a senior member of staff in the organization, it's my responsibility to support them and to provide as much support, whether it be through reflective practice, whether it be through debriefs, whether it be through reminding them and supporting them with well-being, work-life balance, as Danny said, looking at shift patterns, doing all those kind of things. It's been a difficult year. Our staff have been there and they've done it, but they are tired. Like society, I think we're all tired. We're tired of lockdowns, and that's mirrored in frontline services, whether it's the NHS or the homelessness sector. And I think we're mindful of that. And that's that ability to just keep going, but they do, because at the end of the day, they're passionate and motivated to do what they're doing on a daily basis, and fair play. And gosh, yeah, it's incredible to witness, and it's incredible to be a part of. And it's such a time to be proud of the staff in our sector for what they're doing. And I feel blessed to work in Simon community and be part of the story and part of the team that is working in that way. Yeah, thanks, Ray.
Okay, I was going to move on to, this is coming out of, there was a question there a moment ago from Tony McQuillan at Shelter about sort of coordinating efforts and things like that. And I think, you know, one of the aspects of the nature of the movement that we're involved in is that it's quite diverse. There's lots of separate organizations which may be doing relatively similar things, but in slightly different ways. And new ideas come to the fore, and you can find quite a lot of bodies setting up. Food banks is a good example, you know, where, you know, sort of both a sort of increasing problem and a new way of dealing with it came to light, and lots of volunteer-based, sort of regularly church and community-based food bank ideas came up. And similarly with sort of direct services, you know, sleeping bags, food and so on for street homeless, there's a lot of volunteer and relatively diverse groups doing it. And that's what happens when you get a lot of people who feel strongly about something and want to do something. Where do sort of coordinating bodies come in now? And here we have the Council of the Homeless, which sort of coordinates the existing organizations, but not really necessarily accessible to new groups who want to set up and do something. And I'm not sure, Martin, with the Homeless Network in Scotland, whether you're sort of similar to the Council of the Homeless here, or whether, you know, groups that are setting out from scratch to do something that they've decided needs to be done can link into some sort of resource and coordinate with what else is going on so that their effort is to best effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very live issue in Scotland at the moment, Ray, because there's a number of organisations have emerged from COVID, or at least emerged stronger and larger, perhaps than, you know, if they pre-existed. Some of which are constituted, some are not.
Yeah.
And so yes, I mean, it is very much a live issue in Scotland, as it seems to be in Northern Ireland as well. And I think the Homeless Network Scotland's been around for probably about 40 years in various forms. Yeah. But really, you know, really, as I say, over the last year, we've found that our role has been increasingly to bring people together, and we were really pleased to find that relatively early in this process, and also to identify the need for bringing organisations together to speak with one voice, particularly in relation to talking to government, both national and local. But in terms of newer organisations emerging through this, I think there's a discussion I had actually on a sort of semi-personal level actually with somebody recently who's part of a relatively new organisation about this very thing, and talking about, you know, how that can be better coordinated, that phenomenon, if you like. And it's a difficult one. I mean, some organisations are, we know, have been reluctant actually to engage with what I think they see perhaps as the establishment, you know, and very often, although we're certainly not, but I think we're sometimes seen as part of the establishment, just you know, being a constituted mainstream charity. So it's not always on the side of the establishment, as it were. Sometimes there is a reluctance among those organisations themselves actually to appear to be you know, getting in with the establishment. So I think it works both ways.
Okay. Sorry, just before we go on, I'm not sure if Richard's listening in there at the moment. Yeah, I just wanted to check. My recollection was we were to stop about 8:30, and I've seen a couple of the chat things saying that, you know, will some of these contacts be shared and so on. Can I check if you're there, Richard? is the chat going to be saved so that we can circulate afterwards some of the links that Martin and others have put up, and also to let people sort of, you know, be reminded of what the questions were. Right, I'm getting an answer. 5 minutes to go. Chat is not saved. Right, so what I'll maybe do is ask the panelists if they can remember the links that they put into the system to pass them by email either to myself or to Imagine Belfast, so that we can put together some sort of message that can go out to people. I'm not sure in the background whether there will be some sort of bulletin board that sort of says who we all are and how people can find us. But just to sort of deal with that. So in that case, yes, we have about three and a half minutes to go. So what I'm going to do is that would be a good time to ask each of the four of you for 30 seconds worth of what you hope we've gained from this evening. Can I start with you, Martin?
Yes, thanks very much. First of all, just thanks again to everyone for inviting me across the short hop, skip and a jump that is the Irish Sea to Belfast, which I can't quite see from where I live, but I'm sure if I stood up in the tallest house, I might be able to. I think it's just great to hear you know, what's happening somewhere else, and I hope that you and your colleagues and the people tuning in tonight have been interested in some of the things that I've been able to share about what we're doing in Scotland. And you know, we are geographically very close to one another, and I think it's great to see what's happening across the nations and the regions, all parts of the UK, and the different ways that people are dealing with this situation, and yet the similarities and the, you know, things like what Kirsten put so eloquently around, you know, people really coming together, and the points that Danny made and Sean as well, you know, about people coming together, and we need to make sure we don't go back from that. And also that we don't allow ourselves to recede from some of the steps forward that we've made during this as well.
Okay, thanks. Kirsten? Yeah.
For me, it's positive again just to be with people who work in the sector and work and have the passion and motivation to do what they do, and just have an opportunity. And education was spoken about. That's what sessions like this do. They educate each of us. We each learn something. And so that's a really positive thing for me. So thank you very much. And thank you, Ray.
Okay, Danny?
Thanks, Ray. Yeah, just to, I would ask people to take away the really positive news that's coming out, that there is significant amount of collaboration across the sector, that we have been able to make real tangible changes. And most importantly, we have changed, but we've also saved lives, not only over the last number of years, but particularly during COVID. There's a real sense now that we can't go back, and a real steel now to the charities that work with people who are homeless. And I would say that, you know, we're not going to retrench from that position. Innovation, collaboration, partnership working will very much be the future, and should be the future.
Okay, thank you. Sean?
Yeah, I couldn't, it's good to come at the end, because what could I add to what's already been said, other than just to say it's been a very enjoyable and educational conversation. And you know, our organisation is not a homeless or a charity or a homeless organisation, but we very much are at the interface between where the person is on the street, and if we do come across people, we very much point them towards the professionals and the people who know what they're doing. There was one point made there, and I'll finish off quickly, about somebody put the question I thought was very relevant about people popping up and things happening, people handing out sleeping bags, etc. And we've even been approached to try and help do that. We said absolutely not. That's not our job or role. And I think I would encourage anybody that's out there to understand what your role is, and if you're going to set something up, make sure you're not duplicating, or even worse, you know, contributing to the problem, very well-meaningly doing so. I think it's this collaboration we talked about has to be, and this partnership working has to be so good and so seamless that actually it's been positive and has a positive impact, as opposed to well-meaning and not having the proper outcome. So really important to keep these things going, so that everybody knows where they can fit in and add to, as opposed to take away from the tremendous and fantastic professional services that are out there, and reassuring for my volunteers when we come across someone in need who is homeless, or people who are homeless as it is nowadays. We know exactly where to turn to, including the people in these panels and others that are not here tonight, who take that responsibility of us and help the people who need it. And that's very enlightening for us and very rewarding. So thank you to everyone who does that out there. Really important.
Thank you. So I'd just like to wind up, because we are sort of running over the time now. There's a couple of people throwing a couple of last minute questions in, particularly that is the government target of eliminating street homeless, rough sleeping by 2027 feasible? So that's a question for another day, I'm afraid. I'm afraid I'm old enough to remember the International Year of the Homeless on the campaign to abolish homelessness by the millennium. But we're still here, and we'll probably, some of us at least, be still here in a few years' time, hopefully doing as much as we can for this. And I'd like to thank everybody who has joined us today. Obviously, the format of this means you've all been invisible, but thank you for linking in. And I see we've attracted people not just from Northern Ireland and Scotland, but from England as well. So thank you everybody for joining in. Thank you